Good evening. Welcome to another recording of Amazing God and His Amazed People in our Gospel series in the Gospel of Luke. And I'm in a slightly different venue. I'm in Ohio right now, one of the homes of my children in Ohio. And even though Max will no longer make cameo appearances, my German Shepherd, because he has gone on to glory, there is a chocolate lab that may make an appearance that I cannot control here. However, I missed a week and I'm anxious to get back onto a schedule. And I'm excited to open up the Gospel of Luke and see the Gospel in a little bit different framework than I've ever seen it before. I understand the Gospel of Matthew was an eyewitness testimony and very precise in its details, particularly for the Jewish audience. And the Gospel of Mark is really from John Mark, who followed Peter very closely. So it is, and it's the oldest Gospel, it's the first written Gospel, and it too is a eyewitness account narrated from Peter's perspective. And Peter was integral to the development of the disciples from the very beginning. He was sort of probably one of the first chosen, and so that perspective in Mark has that. There's a fair amount of detail in Mark, but there's also a lot of activity. It moves lively through the development of the ministry of Jesus. But the Gospel of Luke is given by Dr. Luke, and it's clearly a compilation of what was known, where Dr. Luke has gone to the various apostles, disciples, and recounted the many stories and events. And although it's framed somewhat similarly to Mark and Matthew, it has a different feel to it. I feel that we see by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit a picture of the ministry as it unfolded, the developing of the disciples as they discover who this Messiah that they had longed, hoped for as a nation and prayed for individually becomes a reality, and the man Jesus lives and breathes among them, and they discover what God is like in the person of Jesus. And we see an unvarnished picture of the disciples who have all their idiosyncrasies, they have their self-focuses, they have their doubts, and they are very much like us. They're very real to us, and Luke unfolds that for us. And so let us continue with Amazing God and His Amazed People. We are in Luke chapter 11, verses 29 through 32. The title of the lesson this week is "The Light of the World is Shining, but people can't see Jesus before them." So the light of the world is shining, and we'll have a very familiar passage about putting our lamp on the lampstand and letting our light shine brightly. But the light of the world is shining. Jesus is the light of the world, and He's shining. But we'll see also that the people can't see Jesus in front of them. They can't see what's right in front of them. And we are like that today as well. We're going to put two passages together that may seem disconnected, but I believe there is a thread. I'm hoping you can discover it with me. Let's remind ourselves of a verse in chapter 10, verse 23, where not too long ago we were looking at this, and we talked about how Jesus rejoiced in the Spirit after the disciples, the 70, had come back from going to many towns, and Jesus said he saw Satan fall from heaven. But then Jesus says in verse 23, "Then he turned to his disciples and said privately, 'Blessed are the eyes which see the things you see.'" Blessed are the eyes that see the things you see. imagine reflecting back, if you were a disciple or now an apostle, reflecting back to that 3-year period of walking with the God of the universe. Blessed are the eyes that see what you have seen. To recognize how God operates, how God is, to recognize Jesus as the Son of God, and to see his perfect balance of humanity and deity, to see his patience and his compassion and his hard work and his industriousness and his knowledge and creativity, but also his innocence, and because he has chosen to limit himself to being in a human framework, to discover in real time the facts of the people around him just as we would. Jesus is operating just as we can operate and be. And imagine being in that close company and observing firsthand Jesus, the Son of God. So with that in our minds, let us look at chapter 11, verses 29 through 32 to start with. And while the crowds were thickly gathered together, he began to say, "This is an evil generation. It seeks a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah the prophet. For as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will rise up into judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here." Let's stop and soak in these words. The two allusions here, one to Jonah, one to the Queen of Sheba, or the Queen of the South that visited Solomon, and how they observed and saw and recognized God reaching down to God's mercy, God's wisdom, God's knowledge. They recognized what was of God, and they had so much less to go on. Yet the people here seeing actually the Son of God in real time, in high definition, right before them, and they're missing it. And Jesus sees that the crowd is thickening, okay? So not just a small crowd or a multitude here, but thickening, the density here. Probably implying coming from all sectors, not just the poorest sectors, not just the acquaintances and friends of the disciples who have been called here, but curiosity seekers, maybe critics, maybe even some that would consider themselves media outlets, even of the leadership of the Pharisees sending their student scribes to take note. And Jesus declares of this crowd here an evil generation. Now, what does he mean by that? Let's speculate a little bit. We often talk about the times we're in as an evil time. And to be quite honest, as I am close to my 65th birthday in about 10 days or so, I remember my grandfather and my parents talking about their times as evil times. Certainly, we would say we're in an evil time with evil generation. And I think there is an evil time at all times in that there are unregenerate people needing salvation around us. So in that sense, it's an evil generation. They're not all saved. There's also the fact that they're not in tune with godliness. Because if you were in tune with godliness, if you knew what godliness looked like, you would recognize it in this man Jesus and his followers as they replicate his teachings. But it's also an evil generation in that they're not coming with open minds to hear and listen and inquire, but they're coming with critical spirits, having predisposed themselves to believe that their religiosity or their self-proclaimed righteousness, their rituals and their traditions, their patterns that they have long established are adequate for righteousness, for being labeled at least as righteous, and they're not looking for, are we truly right? Do we truly have a heart that pleases God? They're not open to that, and so they have a critical spirit, and so they are not weighing all the observables and evidence of what Jesus has already presented, the miracles that have already been attested to and happened before their eyes, and they're not processing that as surely this is a work of God, this is the Son of God speaking to us. And so they're looking for a sign. And often when people look for a sign, it's also a sense of they want to control the narrative, they want to control the situation, they want to have it come in a form of their recognition. They do not want to do the flexing or opening of the heart and mind. So indeed, an evil generation. Is it wrong to seek for validation, a sign? Well, as I mentioned, I've lost my German Shepherd, 3-year-old, which I still call it a puppy, and next week I hope to be taking possession of an actual puppy, a new puppy, and in purchasing that puppy, of course I wanted a sign that this was the right purchase, that this is a wholesome dog. I want to know that he had papers and pedigree, that he's purebred, and I wanted to know that there was evidence that he would be a mild mannered, not a ferocious watchdog, that wouldn't be safe around the grandchildren. I wanted to know that he had and has his veterinary shots and taken care of. And then you also look at the reputation of the breeders, how do they care for their animals and so forth. So yes, we look for validation, and that is not wrong. But here, Jesus has clearly provided that validation. There were the miracles, there was the testimony of the multitudes, and there was the message itself, the 3 M's, if you will. And yet they are seeking a sign. Now, will a sign make the difference of believing? Sometimes we legitimately have one little thing we're stuck on, and it's a barrier, and we're rightly looking to remove that barrier, that little obstacle, because we are open to belief. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. Okay. I know for myself, when I was first investigating the Ministry of Answers in Genesis, and I first met Ken Ham back in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, at a conference over 22, 23 years ago. And I clearly was a Bible-believing, from the first word of Genesis forward, 6-day creationist young earth, but I was going to be a school teacher, and I want to be able with confidence to present before my class exactly this fundamental teaching. And I had questions about was the second law of thermodynamics in effect during creation week? Were things running down and getting disordered as the second law requires? And so I had questions like that. And what about insects? Did birds eat insects, and are insects dying, as it were? Was there death in the Garden of Eden? Do we little details that my questioning mind needed to settle? And in that sense, I was seeking a sign, a verification, a validation from a man running an organization that was proclaiming this truth boldly and clearly. But that's not what this group of people is looking for. They're looking for that one sign that they would recognize as qualified and was sufficient. And the truth of the matter is, probably no sign would ever be sufficient when you have an unbelieving and unopened mind. Because look at the signs that had been done, the undeniable miracles that prove that the Creator himself was at work here. So what signs have they already examined and rejected? We're looking at the critical spirit in a person, and we can't see what's good, okay? We see only the disqualifying, and we don't want to see. The critical spirit doesn't want to see. It poses the idea, the show me, like someone from Missouri, the show me state, but they don't really want to be shown. They don't want to have to rethink and reorganize their worldview. Now the sign of Jonah. What was the sign of Jonah? He was a living fish story. If you would go back to the 4 chapters of Jonah, you would find that Jonah was an unwilling missionary to the Ninevites. Nineveh and the Assyrians, as they came from, are harsh people who would be terrible enemies of Israel, part of the judgment of the northern tribes. And you can understand the antipathy towards them that Jonah would have. And God has to redirect Jonah with the developing of a very large fish that would swallow him up. And some have even proposed that he may actually have died in the fish and been resurrected. Whether that's so or not, that would only make his sign even more similar to the picture he represents. But for 3 days he was in the belly of the fish until he recognized the authority and sovereignty of God, and then went to Nineveh. However, his preaching in Nineveh was not wholeheartedly as it should have been, and yet God was blessing it tremendously. He did not traverse the whole city, which took 3 days to traverse. He only went 1 day in, 1/3 of the way in, and still had a massive revival. And how did that happen? Well, he himself became the object lesson. He was still showing the evidences of the story he would tell about being swallowed by a fish and spit out into dry land. Probably having the seaweed still in his hair and the fish smell about him. How many times do we hear fishermen talk of the great fish, the big fish? Well, this is the biggest fish story ever with the biggest fish. And yet it had credibility. God gave him credibility. And he was such a sign to the Ninevites that they truly were in sackcloth and ashes, from the least to the leaders of the society. And they repented. He was a living fish story, the miracle of the big fish, a visible declaration of God's mercy. And so the Ninevites responded correctly. Secondly, we see the queen of the south, or the queen of Sheba, that will also rise up. And that is a reference to 1 Kings chapter 10. You can turn there briefly. 1 Kings chapter 10 and the first 9 verses here. And now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Critical spirit or evaluating spirit? She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones. Notice she comes appropriately, respectfully, with the idea of these are gifts to be given. And so before she even knows the conclusion, she's prepared to honor the visit. Again, that turns it from a critical spirit to an inquiring spirit. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. Wow, God gave wisdom. God will give us the wisdom when we encounter people too. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, and the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her, no more denying that she's seeing the real thing. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are those servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." Notice that even down to the servants, the wisdom and the beauty of God's presence is making an impact. "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord has loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." The testimony of the Queen of Sheba. She observed, she recognized wisdom, beauty, prosperity, blessing, and notice that she connects it to the Lord. And that how Solomon portrayed was not his ingenuity, his cleverness, his perseverance, but the Lord blessed and directed. And she could attribute it likewise to his God. And she, we believe, came to know the true God. She could see what was right before her there. And Jesus says to his crowd, "A greater than Solomon is here." A greater than Solomon. Remember her testimony of the wisdom and prosperity. And Jesus says, a greater than Solomon is here. Perfection of wisdom, untainted by any self-focus or other agenda. If you have an inquiring spirit, you certainly can see that this is God, Emmanuel, God with us. And so Jesus is not harsh, but is truthful in saying that these, the Ninevites and the Queen of the South, can truly rise up in judgment. They can say, "You have no excuse." So the question is not the lack of evidence or observables. It's really an unbelieving spirit that we need to recognize in ourselves. Rising in judgment, the repentant heart. How would Jesus be a sign of Jonah? He said, "I will give you a sign, I'll be the sign of Jonah." And how would Jesus be the sign of Jonah? He would be hung on the cross. He would die, be buried, and resurrected the third day, coming out of the belly of the earth with new life. Exactly the sign of Jonah. The greatest proof of all is the burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as a nation, Israel is going to reject that, and hence the Gentiles will be included in the church. A sign, Jesus gives a sign. He doesn't deny it. He gives them the greatest of all. First, in 3 years of living ministry, then in his death, burial, and resurrection. There's no lack of a sign. God gives us even what we request. It is our unbelieving spirit, our critical spirit, that doesn't want to be challenged, doesn't want to embrace a new worldview, a rethinking. Now, if the problem is within us, that brings us to the next passage here about truth and light. verses 33 through 36. Let's bring this to a conclusion. No one, when he has lit a lamp, puts it in a secret place or under a basket, but on a lampstand, that those who come in may see the light. The lamp of the body is the eye. Therefore, when your eye is good, your whole body also is full of light. But when your eye is bad, your body is also full of darkness. Therefore take heed that the light which is in you is not darkness. If then your whole body is full of light, having no part dark, the whole body will be full of light, as when the bright shining of a lamp gives you light. Notice the focus here will be on the mechanism of the eye, and the eye is a picture. I think we use this as the word is synecdoche, a part for the whole. Okay, but it's the eye is representing the whole mind and filter of our thoughts. Jesus is the light meant to be brightly shining and illuminate the truth. And he places his lamp, God has placed his lamp, Jesus, clearly before us. I'm turning this around a little bit. In Sunday schools, we might teach our children to be that candle. I'm going to let my candle shine and let my light shine. And that we should tell the gospel and retell the gospel boldly and bravely and brightly. And truly, that is one rendering of this. But I believe what Jesus is also pointing out is God has made available his light very bright and clear and putting it directly in front. No holds barred. Okay. God is letting his lamp, Jesus, clearly shine before us. And so Jesus identifies that there might be a problem. It's not the brightness of the lamp or the placement of the lamp. It is the eye that should be receiving that light. And instead it is receiving darkness. And that light makes the decision of what's going to enter into the heart, mind, and spirit of the individual. What is that truth, that light? It's the truth of the gospel. God has reached down in his Hesed mercy, as Pastor Andrew would teach, the greater reaching down to the lesser. God has reached down. God has availed himself to mankind. Jesus is the accepted sacrifice. He is the redemption. And the new life is real and possible. The ongoing picture of salvation is real and it's possible. So the challenge is, can we see what is right in front of us? Does our lamp, our eye, process truth correctly? Do believers then stand on that truth and shine fully? And how do we put our light under a bushel instead of letting our light shine fully and truthfully? So, watch out for the critical spirit. Are we truly having an inquiring spirit? The light is clearly available. The truth is there. And then how do we let our light so shine before men? We can think in terms of being evangelists and sharing the gospel and living the gospel. But I think there is another aspect to this that we need to consider. I think often we settle for not being as bad as the unregenerate. That we're moderates. We're not extremists, portraying a very different picture than society, but we're moderated. We're safer. And that's not what God is calling us to. We're called to proclaim actual distinctive truth. Examples, okay. Society is wrestling with a question of gender identity. What has God told us clearly? In the beginning, God has created male and female. Male and female created them, okay? So we have a clear truth. Are we clearly standing on that? God is the author of life, and he does not give us the responsibility to judge one another or the ability to take life as in violently, murderously take life. And so we say abortion is wrong. Do we boldly stand on that truth then, that from conception, life is from God, it's a gift from God? And do we support that with helping in the crisis pregnancies and supporting life at all ages, from the very young to the aging? We have clear truths. We have the truth that God is the creator, not that it's a random, meaningless existence. We have the intentional design of a creator and God. And so there are definite truths that we should know and understand. The light that should be coming through us, the light of the Word of God as it's filtered through and processed by the lives that we live and the words that we speak. And so, as believers, we should not just be known for what we are against, but what do we stand for? We should be able to put truth on the pedestal and clearly offer God's truth, which is distinctly different than anything that the world has to offer. Right, Milo? Okay. So, do we just mimic the secular, but modify it, or do we boldly stand? And so I leave you with that challenge here, not to have a critical spirit, but to see that God has clearly communicated His Son in the Gospels and clearly shown us the gospel, the new life, through the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And He has clearly given us truth that it might shine. Greater than Solomon is here. And I come back to our opening thought. Blessed are the eyes which see the things that you see. Thank you, and I pray that you will continue to read the Gospels for yourself with an open mind and recognize the very real people both then and now as we walk with Jesus.